you, Madam President. Madam President, I want to talk about Afghanistan. Senator Lieberman, Senator McCain, Senator Graham took the floor a few minutes ago, and I have some great concerns about the direction that we are heading as well. Yesterday, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, came before the Senate Armed Services Committee and said that success in Afghanistan would probably require more forces and certainly more time. I think all of us who are aware of what's going on there, and certainly I was there last year myself, many of us have gone over there to see for ourselves what the conditions are, and I think clearly we can all agree we are going to have more time in Afghanistan. While the chairman did not specifically ask for more troops and had not had a request from General Stanley McChrystal, who is the senior American officer and NATO commander in Afghanistan, he did, however, indicate that he believed, having heard General McChrystal's views and having great confidence in his leadership, as we all do, a properly resourced counterinsurgency probably means more forces and, without question, more time and more commitment to the protection of the Afghan people and to the development of good governance. There are currently approximately 64,000 American troops in Afghanistan, but it is becoming increasingly clear that we cannot achieve our goals in Afghanistan unless we add additional troops and anticipate a protracted effort. To his credit, President Obama laid out a new strategy in March. It properly put primary emphasis on building the governance capacity of Afghanistan and building up Afghan security forces. He also said that he would send and has 21,000 additional U.S. troops. We know now that that was probably not enough, and more troops will be needed. Just this week, the president said we should not expect a sudden announcement of some huge change in strategy, and he further pledged that the issue was going to be amply debated, not just in Congress, but across the country. Well, Mr. President, I welcome that debate. We need to agree as a nation on a strategy for victory, on the resources necessary to complete the mission. We need to block attempts by the cut-and-run crowd to limit the deployments and operations of U.S. troops or tie their hands for what they can do while they're there. We do need more Afghan forces. It should also be abundantly clear that if our strategy is going to work, that we must have another resource. I want to call attention to the role of NATO. With the Taliban resurgent and casualties rising to levels never seen before in Afghanistan, we must have more security forces in Afghanistan, and it is well past time for our NATO allies to step up and do their part. The security of the free world is at stake in Afghanistan. You know, sometimes there has been legitimate argument about whether there is a legitimate American interest in some of the places that we have gone. It cannot be questioned that in Afghanistan, our security interests are at stake. In fact, the credibility of the NATO alliance is at stake, Madam President, and I think whether the NATO alliance proves that it can be successful and relevant in today's world is at stake in Afghanistan. NATO countries need to realize how much there is in all of our interests to defeat the Taliban resurgence and prevent a new al-Qaeda safe haven from developing there. We need to prevent ungoverned territory in Afghanistan from being used by terrorists with global reach, and the only way to ensure this is through a strong and stable Afghan government. But they're not going to get there without the help of the NATO alliance. The horrors of September 11 were only a taste of what the terrorists with global reach might accomplish if they have uncontested territory from which to operate. Our NATO partners need to realize that the credibility and relevance of the alliance itself is now being tested in Afghanistan. NATO no longer faces a threat on the continent of Europe, or even on the periphery of Europe. For NATO to be relevant, it must have a global expeditionary role in the defense of our common interests, particularly against the threat of global terrorism. If NATO can't succeed in Afghanistan, where we all agree NATO must succeed, the alliance will be weakened to the point that will call into question, will it succeed anywhere? Many NATO countries are present in Afghanistan, but among them, only a few are bearing the brunt of combat operations. Great Britain, Canada, the Netherlands, Denmark, and of course the United States. But just this week, Canada announced its intention to pull out all forces by 2011. Other NATO allies have limited operations of their troops through restrictions on their missions. Restrictions, Madam President, that I think are a little embarrassing, frankly. For example, some nations that have signed up, part of NATO, willing to do their part in Afghanistan, refuse to conduct any operations at night. Others refuse to carry Afghan soldiers on their helicopters. Others are prohibited from participating in combat unless they are fired on and protecting their own base. In other words, they are prohibited from coming to the aid of an ally under attack. Let's be frank. If a NATO member cannot handle the responsibilities of alliance membership, they should not enjoy the privileges and prestige of membership. Our NATO allies need to remember what was agreed to in Bonn, December of 2001. The alliance gave their solemn word to help Afghanistan overcome the ravages of terrorism and civil war. The credibility of our allies is at stake. Madam President, the NATO alliance has a very simple mission. It is, if one is attacked, we are all attacked. America has come to the aid of European nations well into the last century, throughout the last century. America was attacked on 9/11, 2001. And Madam President, we have not seen the response that would meet the test of the mission of NATO. We have not seen our allies on the field in Iraq, with notable exceptions. Great Britain has always been there. Others have been there part-time, but America has carried the lion's share. They are carrying, by far, the lion's share in Iraq today. Afghanistan, which is the hotbed in that area between Afghanistan and Pakistan of Al-Qaeda, which was the attacker of our country on 9/11. NATO agreed in December of 2001 that they would be engaged in Afghanistan. And yet, NATO has not fulfilled its responsibility, even though the lion's share of our troops who have done an outstanding job, our troops that are fatigued from overdeployment, they have done their jobs, but they have not had the help of NATO. NATO is supported by the taxpayers of America because we thought it would be an alliance that would come to our aid as we have come to the aid of every member of NATO. The United States pays 24% of the operating costs of NATO. Now, I'm the ranking member of the Military Construction Subcommittee of Appropriations, and I can tell you that the military enhancements and military construction for NATO is in the range of $230 million in this year's bill. It is usually in that range, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but basically America is paying $250 million every year for military construction and enhancements for NATO. There aren't NATO bases in America. They are in other places. And yet, we are having to now put more troops on the line because our NATO allies have restrictions, except for the ones that I have named that are in full combat and full partners and doing their jobs, and we appreciate that so much. But I think the NATO alliance must step up to the plate as we are debating more troops, which I know that we will do what's necessary because America always does what's necessary. And I think our NATO allies know that, and sometimes they just sit back and let us do it. They let our taxpayers pay the tab. They let our troops be the ones that lead in the field. We went to Bosnia. Bosnia was in their backyard, but they needed for us to step in Kosovo. We have been there for them to step in because when it's necessary, America is there. But Madam President, when we are debating the increase in troop strength in Afghanistan, which everyone who's been there knows we are going to need, let's not forget to bring in another source that would help America in this time of need while we are continuing to keep our commitments in Iraq with very little help from the outside, while we still have troops in Bosnia, and while we have 64,000 troops, the lion's share, in Afghanistan. Now we're looking at sending more. And Madam President, I think now is the time for us to put it on the table for our NATO allies that they have a commitment if the NATO alliance is relevant. If one is attacked, we're all attacked is a great, simple, clear mission. But it is not simply successful because we have the right mission. It takes every member doing its fair share, and most certainly at a time when America is doing so much more. This is the time for our allies to take the shackles off, to engage, to be in combat, to put our treasure on the line with their treasure and not just our treasure alone. I think it is time for us, and I call on the President to call on NATO to step up to the plate and fulfill the mission. Terrorism is the enemy of every NATO country. This is not an American fight. It is a global fight for freedom. If we lose in Afghanistan and give unfettered territory for operations of al-Qaeda, every NATO country will be attacked. Don't they see it? Don't they have the commitment and the courage to stand up? Just because it is in another country and seems far away, can they be so naive? Madam President, when we talk about more American troops, as the President has said we will, I ask the President to look for more troops from other sources as well, and ask our allies to step up to the plate and be our partners as NATO envisioned. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.